What if the most powerful system for transforming your life has been sitting in ancient manuscripts for over 2,000 years, and almost nobody is actually using it correctly? Picture this. You wake up tomorrow, and no matter what the day delivers, a canceled deal, an unfair accusation, an unexpected loss, your composure stays intact, not because you've gone numb, not because you've suppressed something, but because you've trained your mind to respond rather than react. That is not a fantasy. That is Stoicism. And today we are going deep inside its 12 core principles to show you exactly how they function in real, modern life, not in marble halls, but in traffic jams and difficult conversations and 3 a.m. worry. The Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus, were not armchair philosophers spinning abstractions from comfortable studies. Marcus Aurelius governed the Roman Empire through back-to-back plagues, military crises, and the deaths of people he loved. Epictetus was born into slavery, owned nothing, and became one of history's most influential teachers. Seneca navigated the court of Emperor Nero, one of the most dangerous men in history, and somehow kept his principles intact, at least until the end. These were people tested by genuine fire. What they discovered under that pressure was a philosophy so precise and so practical that modern neuroscientists, therapists, military leaders, and elite performers still borrow from it daily. So if you've ever wondered why some people seem genuinely unshakable, why certain individuals rise while others collapse under the exact same pressures, the answer isn't luck. It isn't temperament you either have or don't. It is philosophy, it is practice, and it is learnable. Stay with me, because by the end of this video you won't just understand these principles intellectually. You will have a clear, practical sense of how to apply them, starting today. Before we begin, if this kind of content helps you think more clearly and live more deliberately, subscribe to Stoic Sight. That's what this channel exists for. Now let's get into it. 1. The discipline of what you can control. Here is a situation every single person watching this knows well. You are running late. The traffic is not moving. Your phone is buzzing with messages you haven't yet answered, and somewhere beneath your ribcage a slow, familiar fire begins to burn. Now ask yourself honestly, in that moment, what exactly are you fighting against? Not the traffic. Traffic is indifferent to your frustration. You are fighting your own mind, and in most cases, losing Epictetus, who spent the early years of his life in chains as a Roman slave, developed what may be the single most liberating idea in the entire history of philosophy. He called it the dichotomy of control. Some things lie within our power, he wrote. Others do not. Our opinions, our desires, our efforts, these belong to us entirely. Everything else, the weather, other people's behavior, market conditions, delayed flights, the opinions of strangers, is not ours and never was. And here is the part that changes everything. When you stop spending energy on what you cannot move, you suddenly discover an enormous surplus of power for what you can. Return to that traffic jam. You cannot dissolve the cars ahead of you, but you can control whether you use that time to spiral into mounting stress or to listen to something that sharpens your thinking. You can control whether you arrive frazzled and reactive or composed and ready. The traffic is identical in both scenarios. Your experience of it is not. And over time, the gap between those two experiences accumulates into a completely different quality of daily life. Marcus Aurelius returned to this principle again and again in his private journals, the writings we now call the Meditations. He reminded himself daily that the mind has authority over itself, not over the world, but over its own response to the world. He did this not because it came naturally, but because it required constant practice. Modern psychology has since caught up to what the Stoics always understood: cognitive behavioral therapy. Among the most rigorously evidence-backed approaches in the mental health field, is built on essentially the same foundation. Our distress does not primarily come from events. It comes from our interpretation of events, and that interpretation is something we can learn to examine and redirect. The storm cannot sink you if you decide not to let it inside the ship. So the next time you feel the grip of frustration tightening around you, pause. Ask one precise question. Is this within my control? If the answer is no, release it. Not because the situation is unimportant, because your energy is too finite and too valuable to spend on walls that will not move regardless. Practice this for 1 week. A single week. You will be genuinely surprised by how much mental space suddenly becomes available, and what you are able to do with it, and what you do with that freed up space is exactly where the second principle comes in. 2. Finding the opening inside the obstacle. There is a phrase Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself that has survived nearly 2,000 years intact. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Ride that slowly and sit with it. He was not speaking poetically. He wrote those words during one of the bloodiest periods in Roman history, surrounded by ongoing war, recurring plague, and persistent political betrayal. He meant it literally. He had experienced enough of life to know that every genuine obstacle, when met with the right orientation, becomes the training ground for exactly the skill required to overcome it. But here is what almost everyone gets wrong about this idea. It is not about toxic positivity. It is not about pretending problems don't exist or painting a forced smile over genuine suffering. It is about mining the difficulty, going into it deliberately and extracting what it contains. What does a rejected job application actually contain? Information. Maybe the positioning wasn't specific enough. Maybe the role wasn't the right fit. Maybe the timing was off, and a better opportunity is closer than it appears. The rejection is raw material. What you build from it depends entirely on the questions you bring to it. Epictetus taught that difficulty is not the opposite of growth. It is growth, applied, uncomfortable, and ultimately reshaping. Think honestly about the hardest periods of your own life. A failed relationship, a financial reversal, a stretch when nothing went according to plan. When you look back at those seasons now, if you look honestly, they almost always produced something real. A sharper sense of who you are, a new direction you wouldn't have found otherwise, a capacity for something you didn't have before. Every difficulty either breaks you or builds you. The difference is what you choose to look for inside it. The Stoics were not interested in suffering as a romantic ideal. They were interested in turning suffering into momentum. Seneca described adversity as the proving ground of great character, not because hardship is inherently noble, but because the person who navigates through it and continues forward has been tested and forged into something stronger than they were before. So the next time life presents you with an obstacle, and it will, because that is what life does, try asking a different question. Not why is this happening to me, but what is this preparing me for? That single shift can change the entire arc of the story. 3. The only place where life actually happens. If you have ever eaten a full meal while scrolling your phone, you have already experienced the opposite of what we are about to discuss. You consumed food. You were not present for a meal. You were physically there. You were somewhere else entirely. The Stoics were remarkably specific about the present moment, not as a wellness concept or a trending mindfulness buzzword, but as the only real unit of time a human being ever actually inhabits. The past is memory, real, and worthy of learning from, but not a place you can return to. The future is anticipation, useful for planning, but not yet real. The only place where genuine life occurs, where decisions are made, where love is expressed, where effort is actually applied, is right now, in the present. And yet most of us spend a substantial portion of our mental lives somewhere else. We replay conversations that ended hours ago. We rehearse arguments that may never happen. We project ourselves into futures that haven't arrived and stand trial for failures that haven't occurred. We miss the only moment that was ever real because we're too busy auditing the one that's already gone or dreading the one that hasn't come. Marcus Aurelius wrote with real precision on this point. He noted that the present moment is all anyone ever genuinely possesses. The person who fails to inhabit it is failing to possess the only thing they actually have. Seneca observed that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. The mind, left without guidance, drifts naturally toward worry and regret, toward the worst-case interpretation of what hasn't happened yet, or the sore point from what already has. Stoic practice is about redirecting that drift, consciously, deliberately, and repeatedly. Practical application. The next time you notice your mind pulling away from what's in front of you, during a conversation, during a walk, during a quiet moment that should be restful, gently return it. No guilt, no elaborate technique, just return. This is not about achieving some permanent state of serene transcendence. Marcus Aurelius himself admitted in his private writings that his mind wandered constantly. The practice is the act of noticing and returning. That is where genuine presence is built, not in maintaining it without interruption, but in come back to it again and again without judgment. When you begin practicing real presence, something quietly unexpected happens. You start noticing how rich ordinary moments actually are. The quality of a conversation with someone you trust, the particular quality of light in the late afternoon, the first breath of genuinely cool morning air. These are not small or trivial things. These are what a life is actually made of, and you can only experience them when you are actually there. For building the foundation of self-mastery, let us talk about self-discipline, and let us do it without the usual lecture about cold showers, 5 a.m. alarm clocks, and suffering as a spiritual practice. Self-discipline, at its Stoic root, is not about punishment or deprivation. It is not about white-knuckling your way through discomfort to prove something to yourself or to impress anyone watching. It is about alignment. It is about learning to act consistently from your values rather than from your impulses, especially, when the impulse is loud and the value is quiet. Epictetus said that the first and greatest victory is to conquer yourself, not other people, not circumstances. Yourself, the part of you that reaches for distraction when focus is what the moment actually requires, that seeks comfort when growth demands discomfort, that avoids the honest conversation that would clear the air, that postpones the work that only starting will make easier. Here is the insight that most people miss about self-discipline. It is not a trait you either possess or lack. It is a capacity you build through repetition, through small daily decisions that most people don't notice or celebrate, but which accumulate over time into something called character. Marcus Aurelius lived in one of the most privileged positions in the ancient world. As emperor, he could have indulged virtually any appetite without consequence. Instead, he chose early rising, plain meals, rigorous physical routine, and hours of writing and reflection. Not because he hated comfort, but because he understood something essential. A person governed entirely by their appetites is not free. They are owned by those appetites, and that ownership is invisible precisely because it feels like personal preference. Seneca framed it this way. He wrote that no person is truly free who is not master of themselves. Real freedom, not freedom from responsibility or consequences, but genuine inner freedom, requires self-command. It requires the capacity to choose your long-term intention over your immediate desire repeatedly until the choice becomes natural. Where do you begin? Not at the summit. Begin at the base. Identify one area of your life where your actions most consistently diverge from your actual intentions. Is it sleep, spending, focus? The amount of time you spend on things that drain rather than build you? Choose one. Set a modest, clear, specific standard. Hold it for 1 week, not perfectly, consistently. There is a meaningful difference. Every time you choose your long-term intention over your short-term impulse, You are not just winning a small internal battle. You are writing a sentence in the story of who you are, and eventually, enough sentences produce a narrative that becomes your identity, and that identity becomes the thing you return to even when circumstances make it difficult. Self-discipline is not constructed in dramatic moments of willpower. It is built in quiet, ordinary, unwitnessed ones. The moment you close the app and open the book. The moment you get up instead of hitting snooze for the 4th time. The moment you choose the honest response when a comfortable deflection was right there waiting. Those moments, accumulated over months and years, produce a person of extraordinary reliability. Not because they were born that way, because they built that way, one small decision at a time. 5. Developing a mind that doesn't break. Emotional resilience is not the absence of feeling. Let us be precise about that from the very beginning of this section, because the misunderstanding here runs deep. The Stoics were frequently and persistently misread as cold, detached, and emotionally hollow, people who had somehow switched off their feelings and processed everything through gray intellectual machinery. This is a fundamental distortion of what they actually taught and actually lived. Marcus Aurelius grieved openly and at length in his private writings. Seneca wrote with extraordinary vulnerability about loneliness, loss, and the terror of death. Epictetus spoke with real warmth about human connection and the tenderness of genuine friendship. What distinguished them was not that they didn't feel deeply, it was that they had developed the capacity to feel deeply without being dismantled by what they felt. And that distinction between feeling something fully and being completely controlled by it is one of the most practically valuable things any person can develop across an entire lifetime. Think about a recent moment when an emotion arrived without invitation. Anger, fear, shame, despair, and drove you to say or do something you later wished you could take back. The emotion came in like a wave and swept a decision out to sea before you could catch it. Most of us have more of those moments than we want to acknowledge. Resilience doesn't mean the wave stops coming. It means you have learned to stand in the surf without losing your footing. You feel the pull, you acknowledge the full force of it, and then you make a choice about how to respond, rather than having the emotion make that choice for you. Marcus Aurelius described this as the space between stimulus and response. Before you react, there is a moment, brief, easy to miss, but genuinely real, in which you retain agency. Emotional resilience is built by learning to inhabit that moment consistently. But here is the part that requires real, sustained work. You cannot expand that moment by wishing it larger or reading about it. You expand it by practicing the act of pausing repeatedly in real situations with real stakes. Pause before you reply to the message that made your blood pressure spike. Pause before you escalate the disagreement. Pause before you make the decision your future self will spend months trying to undo. In that pause, ask the one question that reorients everything. What response here actually aligns with the person I have chosen to become? Practical tools for building this capacity over time. Writing down your emotional triggers regularly, naming the specific emotion before acting on it, using deliberate slow breathing to interrupt the physiological cascade, reviewing your reactions at the end of each day without self-condemnation. Progress is not linear. There will be days when the wave is larger than your footing and you get swept. That is not failure. That is the practice showing you where the next training needs to happen. 6. Remembering the only certainty, memento mori. Remember that you will die. Stay with that for a moment before the impulse to scroll past it arrives. Because the Stoics understood something about human psychology that most modern people spend enormous energy avoiding. The awareness of death, when properly held and genuinely internalized, is not a source of fear or despair. It is the most powerful clarity-generating tool available to a human being. It is a scalpel for cutting away what genuinely doesn't matter. When you truly internalize that your time is finite, not as a vague abstraction you intellectually acknowledge, but as a lived, daily awareness, your priorities rearrange themselves almost immediately. The petty irritations that consumed so much mental real estate begin to look different. The postponed conversations, the deferred dreams, the life you keep promising yourself when conditions are finally right, all of it looks different under this lens. Marcus Aurelius returned to this meditation constantly throughout his private writings. He reminded himself that emperors and slaves end in the same place, that fame, status, and power dissolve quickly after death, and that what endures, to the extent that anything endures, is how honestly and how fully you lived. He wrote, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." This is not morbid philosophy. This is a surgical tool for the removal of triviality. Think honestly about what you have been postponing. The conversation with someone you love that keeps getting pushed back to a better time. The project you've been promising yourself you'll start when things calm down, and things never quite calm down. The life you've quietly committed to living someday, in some version of the future that remains permanently just out of reach. Memento Mori says, conditions will never be perfectly right. The future is not a reliable storage space for things that actually matter now. Your time is not renewable. Seneca wrote that most people behave as though life will extend indefinitely, and as a result, they squander it on things that never deserved it, things they wouldn't choose if they were thinking clearly. The awareness of death is not an invitation to nihilism. It is an invitation to take your own life seriously. Here is the reframe that makes this practice livable rather than suffocating. Memento Mori is not a meditation on death. It is a meditation on the quality of being alive. Use it as a filter. Before committing significant time or energy to something, ask, if I look back from the end, will this have actually mattered? Let the honest answer shape your choice. Say the things that need to be said. Pursue what genuinely matters to you, not just what's easiest or most convenient. 7. The radical act of appreciation. Gratitude, as the Stoics practiced it, was not a soft concept, and it was not an exercise in forced positivity. It was about training perception, specifically redirecting a very particular default setting of the human mind. The mind, by evolutionary design, is a problem detection machine. It was built to scan relentlessly for threats, deficits, and approaching dangers, and that capacity is genuinely useful when real threats exist. But in modern life, that same circuitry runs continuously and indiscriminately, scanning for what's wrong, what's missing, what could go wrong next, what should be different. Left unchecked, it produces a chronic low-grade awareness of insufficiency, of having something but feeling like it's not quite enough. Gratitude is the deliberate, consistent act of redirecting that scanner toward what is present, not toward what is absent. And when you genuinely direct sustained attention toward what you have rather than what you lack, the landscape of your life changes, not because your circumstances have shifted, but because you are finally perceiving what was already there. Marcus Aurelius wrote that when he rose each morning, he reminded himself what a privilege it was to be alive, to breathe, to think, to love, to act with intention. This from a man carrying the full weight of the Roman Empire on his shoulders, grieving personal losses, managing military crises, navigating political threats. He found something worth appreciating before he had cleared his first hour. Seneca wrote extensively about the tendency of human desire to always outpace satisfaction, how we achieve one thing and immediately relocate the finish line to the next, never pausing to genuinely inhabit what we've already reached. He described this pattern as one of the primary obstacles to real contentment. His prescription was not to stop wanting or striving, but to develop the simultaneous capacity to appreciate where you are, while moving toward where you're going. Both things can be true at once. They are not contradictory, they are complementary. Epictetus offered a different approach. He encouraged his students to periodically consider what their lives would look like without the things they currently take for granted. Not as a dark exercise in dread, but as a way of restoring felt appreciation for what already exists before losing it makes that appreciation arrive too late. A simple practice: before sleep, name 3 things from your specific day that you genuinely appreciate. Not generic platitudes, specific things. A conversation that felt real. A moment of unexpected quiet. Progress on something that actually mattered. Do this daily without skipping for 30 days. The effect is measurable. Research in positive psychology consistently confirms what the Stoics observed intuitively. Deliberate, specific gratitude practice reshapes the resting state of the mind. It does not make hard things disappear. It ensures that the good things don't disappear unnoticed. Swallowed up in the noise of perpetual striving, the richest person isn't the one who has the most. It's the one who needs the least to feel genuinely full. Gratitude is the practice that closes that distance. 8. The pursuit of your own standard. Marcus Aurelius wrote something so direct it can feel almost blunt. Waste no more time arguing about what a good person should be. Be one. This is the Stoic call to personal excellence, and it is noticeably, deliberately self-directed. Not, be the best compared to the person ahead of you. Not, be the most impressive version of yourself in the eyes of whoever happens to be in the room. Be the best version of yourself, as measured by your own considered values, lived out consistently in how you actually move through your ordinary days. Personal excellence in the Stoic tradition has remarkably little to do with external achievement, and this is precisely where the concept becomes genuinely, uncomfortably countercultural. We exist inside a performance culture. We are constantly measured, ranked, compared, and scored. Social media has made this ambient, a continuous, auto-refreshing broadcast of curated highlights from other people's lives, against which we calibrate our own sense of adequacy, usually unfavorably. The result, for most people, is a persistent low-grade sense of falling short, of almost being enough but not quite. The Stoic antidote is to set your own standard, not based on who's ahead of you or behind you in any external ranking, but based on who you have consciously decided to become. Seneca wrote about the gap between who we perform as for others and who we actually are in private, and described the daily work of narrowing that gap not by performing better for the audience, but by actually being better when no one is watching and no one will ever know. Epictetus extended this to how we handle failure and setback. Excellence, he said, is not visible only in success. It is visible, perhaps most clearly, in how we respond when things go wrong. Do we crumble, deflect blame, and quietly give up? Or do we absorb the lesson honestly, recalibrate without self-pity, and move forward with whatever we now know that we didn't before? A person of genuine excellence does not require perfect outcomes. They require honest effort aligned with clear, self-chosen values. Set your own standard. Measure yourself against your own potential, not someone else's performance. Show up for that standard in private when no external reward is visible and no audience is present. Trust the accumulation. Private integrity, sustained over time, eventually produces something publicly recognizable, but more importantly, it produces something internally unshakable. That is the Stoic version of excellence, and unlike external achievement, it cannot be taken away. 9. The freedom that comes from releasing the crowd. Here is a question worth sitting with honestly. How many of your decisions today were genuinely yours? How many were made from a place of real desire or considered values? And how many were shaped, at least in part, by what someone else might think if they found out? This is one of the most pervasive, least acknowledged sources of suffering in modern life, and the Stoics named it precisely 2,000 years before social media gave it entirely new dimensions. Marcus Aurelius wrote something remarkable on this exact theme. He observed that human beings love themselves above almost everything else, and yet they give more weight to the passing opinion of others than to their own deliberate judgment of themselves. He found this contradiction both fascinating and quietly tragic. Epictetus was more direct about it. The approval of others, he taught consistently, is entirely outside your control. You cannot dictate what people think of you. You cannot guarantee their admiration. You cannot reliably earn their respect through performance because their response is theirs, not yours. What you can determine clearly, repeatedly, and with full authority is whether you are living in alignment with your own principles. And that inner alignment is infinitely more stable than the approval of a crowd whose opinion will shift without warning. Seneca framed freedom from others' opinion as one of the highest and most genuinely rare achievements a person can reach in an entire life. He described it as internal sovereignty, a state in which you are genuinely the author of your own experience, rather than an actor continuously performing for reviews that never fully arrive or never quite satisfy when they do. Now, this doesn't mean becoming indifferent to people or withdrawing from community. The Stoics were deeply social philosophers. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about obligation to others, about friendship, about shared life. The principle is not isolation, it is independence of judgment, the capacity to care for people deeply without making their opinion of you the condition of your self-worth. Practically, begin noticing the specific moments when you feel the pull of external validation. Not to judge yourself for feeling it, that pull is universal, but simply to observe it with clarity. Notice when you're about to say something for the audience rather than because it is true. Notice when you're avoiding something primarily because of what someone might think, not because you genuinely believe it's wrong. Over time, that clear observation creates space, and in that space you begin to make choices that are actually yours. This is not selfishness, it is integrity, and it is the foundation of a life that, when you look back at it, you will be able to recognize as genuinely your own. 10. Becoming fluid in the face of change. Everything changes. This was not, for Marcus Aurelius, a philosophical position he arrived at through abstract reasoning. It was a fact of nature that governing a complex empire made unavoidable. Empires rise and collapse. People arrive and depart without schedule. Circumstances shift without warning and rarely according to the plan. And yet most of us relate to change as though it were a disruption, as though life is supposed to remain stable by default, and change is an intrusion on that stability. The Stoics offered a fundamentally different frame. Change is not an interruption to life. Change is the nature of life. The river does not stop and apologize for moving. To resist its flow is not to protect what matters. It is to spend your energy fighting a current that was always going to move regardless. Seneca warned specifically against the suffering produced by excessive attachment to how things currently are, not because what we have doesn't matter or shouldn't be valued, but because clinging too tightly to a fixed picture of how life must look is a guaranteed path to suffering, because the picture will always, eventually, change. The only question is whether we meet that change, having prepared ourselves to adapt, or having spent all our energy refusing to acknowledge it was coming. Epictetus drew a sharp distinction worth holding. We cannot control what changes around us, but we retain full authority over how we meet the change when it arrives. This transforms change from something that happens to us into something we actively engage. The difference in experience between those two orientations is enormous. When a relationship ends, when a career shifts, when a plan dissolves, the Stoic question is not, how do I get back to what I had, but what does this create space for, and what is possible from here that wasn't possible before? not forced optimism. Clear-eyed, deliberate inquiry. Marcus Aurelius wrote about impermanence with a kind of radical acceptance that went beyond resignation. He noted that even the most powerful forces in human experience are temporary, and rather than making that fact a source of grief, he used it as motivation to engage fully with what was present right now. Because if everything is temporary, then the current moment, with all its difficulty and its beauty, is genuinely irreplaceable. Adaptability is therefore not just a Stoic virtue. It is the foundational survival skill in a world that does not stop changing and never will. Cultivate it deliberately, practice it consistently, and change gradually loses much of its power to destabilize the core of who you are. 11. The Stoic case for genuine connection. This one surprises people. When most people picture a Stoic, the popular image, the cultural shorthand, they picture solitude. The self-contained individual, needing nothing and no one, processing everything in cool internal silence. But read the primary texts carefully, and a very different picture emerges with considerable consistency. Marcus Aurelius wrote repeatedly about community, friendship, and shared obligation with real warmth, not as philosophical formality. He described human beings as social creatures not by preference but by nature itself, meaning that genuine connection is not a luxury or an optional addition to a well-lived life. It is a component of it. Compassion, in the Stoic framework, is not a soft extra. It is a logical conclusion that follows directly from understanding your own condition. If you know what uncertainty feels like, and you know what loss feels like, and you know what it is to want desperately to live meaningfully despite all the difficulty, then encountering another person's struggle with contempt or dismissal is not just unkind. It is philosophically inconsistent with what you actually know about being human. Seneca wrote that every person who wrongs you is acting from some combination of ignorance and pain. This is not an excuse for the wrong. It is a frame for your response to it. Meeting cruelty with cruelty adds to the total amount of cruelty in the world. Meeting it with understanding, when you genuinely can, does something measurably different. Epictetus encouraged his students to approach every person with genuine curiosity about their inner life, their history, their pressures, their perspective, before arriving at any firm judgment. Not naivety, curiosity. The working assumption that there is more going on beneath the surface than is visible from where you're standing. Practically, listening, genuinely listening, without composing your reply while the other person is still speaking, is one of the most consistently undervalued practices available to any person in daily life. It costs nothing in material terms. It changes everything about the quality of connection that becomes possible. Small acts of real, focused attention produce ripples far larger than their apparent size in the moment. A question asked with genuine interest. A response that actually acknowledges what was said, rather than steering back toward your own agenda. The willingness to sit with someone in difficulty, rather than rushing past it to the resolution. These are not grand philosophical gestures. They are daily, ordinary practices, and they build the kind of relationships that actually sustain a human life through its harder seasons. The seasons when what you most need is to not be alone in it. The Stoics lived in a world of genuine collective responsibility. Marcus Aurelius made decisions that affected millions. Seneca counseled emperors. They understood viscerally that personal excellence practiced in isolation from others was incomplete. The examined life was always also a relational one. Compassion is how Stoic philosophy reaches outward, and it completes the picture. 12. The habit that makes all others possible. Every night, Epictetus recommended a practice that his students carried with them through their entire lives. Before sleep, before the day fully closed, they reviewed it. Not as judges arriving at a verdict, as students examining the work. What did I do well today? Where did I fall short of the standard I've set? What opportunity appeared that I missed or failed to recognize in time? What did I say or choose that I'd take back if I genuinely could? This is the practice of daily reflection, and it may be the single highest leverage habit in the entire Stoic repertoire. Not the most dramatic, the most leverage-producing. Here is why. Almost everything else we have discussed in this video, directing your focus, building resilience, developing self-discipline, practicing genuine presence, requires a functional feedback loop in order to actually improve. Without reflection, you have no real information about whether you are progressing. You are navigating without instruments, and direction becomes a matter of hope rather than intention. Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, perhaps the most intimate philosophical document to survive from any major historical figure, is essentially a sustained daily journal of honest self-examination. He was not writing for posterity. He almost certainly didn't intend for anyone else to read it. He was writing to hold himself accountable, to examine his own impulses and reactions, to reaffirm his values before they could erode quietly under the continuous pressure of power and circumstance. Seneca recommended asking 3 specific questions of yourself at the end of each day. Have I resisted any of my habitual weaknesses today? Have I made any genuine improvement? Did I treat the people I encountered with the care and attention they deserved? The answers, recorded honestly and reviewed across weeks and months, become something remarkable. A map, a real, specific, personal map of your growth. Not growth as society defines or scores it, but growth as you have chosen to define it, measured against your own values and intentions. Practically, you do not need a beautiful journal, a specific format, or a formal system. You need 5 minutes and a genuine commitment to honesty. What went well today and why? What didn't and what that tells you? What tomorrow holds that deserves your conscious attention before it arrives? Do that consistently for 30 days, and you will understand your own patterns, tendencies, and triggers in ways that years of passive living simply cannot produce. You will know where your actual growth edges are, not the ones that look good to discuss, but the ones where you actually need to do the work. Reflection is not navel-gazing. It is quality control applied to the most important project any human being will ever undertake. The project of their own character. And character, the Stoics believed with complete consistency, is the only thing no external circumstance can ever take from you. It is yours entirely. 12 principles, more than 2,000 years of testing under genuine pressure, and the most remarkable thing about them is not how old they are. It is how entirely, specifically relevant they remain to the life you are living right now. In this particular moment, with all its uncertainty and noise, control your focus, mine your obstacles, live in the present, build self-mastery, develop emotional strength, remember your mortality, practice genuine gratitude, hold your own standard, release the crowd's opinion, embrace change, extend real compassion, review your days with honesty. These are not 12 separate habits running on 12 separate tracks. They are 12 facets of the same underlying orientation toward life, one the Stoics called eudaimonia, not happiness in the shallow, conditions-dependent sense, a deeper, more stable flourishing that holds its ground even when circumstances don't cooperate. The world will keep being uncertain, challenges will keep arriving, people will disappoint, circumstances will keep shifting, and life will continue to offer no guarantees about outcomes. What you can guarantee, what is always within your authority, is how you meet all of it, the quality of your attention, the integrity of your response, the consistency of your effort. You cannot control what the day brings. You can absolutely control what you bring to the day. If something in this video gave you a frame worth carrying into your week, a principle, a practice, a single question to ask yourself at a moment that matters, hit like and subscribe to Stoic Sight. This channel exists for the people who want more than surface-level inspiration. We are here for the actual, daily, quiet, unglamorous work of becoming someone you genuinely respect. The journey is the practice. The practice never really ends. See you in the next one.